South African former politician and author of Shadow Work book and film, Andrew Feinstein. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. So please could you outline your background in the South African liberation struggle, very short, very briefly?
I was born in South Africa, obviously as a privileged white person under apartheid, and from a very young age realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the system of racist oppression. So in my late teens, started to get involved in African townships and squatter settlements around Cape Town where I lived, and soon got involved with ANC underground structures, which were illegal and banned structures at that point. I then had to leave the country in the mid-1980s to avoid serving in the apartheid military. And when I returned to the country after the ANC had been unbanned, I first worked as a facilitator in our constitutional negotiations process that led to our first democratic elections, and then was elected to Parliament in 1994, our first democratic election, where I served the ANC for about 7.5 years.
Could you give us a broad outline of the work you are currently engaged in the relation to the global arms trade?
So I run a very small organization based in London called Shadow World Investigations, and we investigate the global arms trade, looking at all sorts of malfeasance or wrongdoing in the trade. So corruption, the trade accounts for around 40% of all corruption in global trade. Human rights abuses that are perpetrated using the weapons that are traded. The lack of meaningful controls and regulation of the arms trade, and any other aspect of the arms trade and the way it impacts on our politics and economics.
Turkey is a priority target for UK and German arms trading. Can you tell us more about any work you have done in this area?
So we've done a bit of work on Turkey while we were researching and writing the Shadow World book. It also comes up regularly in quite a lot of arms trade work for a number of reasons. Turkey, from a period from the late 1990s through to a year or two ago, tended to be about fifth in the nation's importing weaponry. In addition to which, in the last few years, Turkey has started to produce quite a lot of its own weaponry for itself and started to export some weaponry. A lot of the arms deals in relation to Turkey are characterized by high levels of corruption, and the arms trade is often used as a source of money for politicians, their political parties, and for those around them. The patronage that keeps them in power. And Turkey is certainly no exception in that regard. In addition to which, of course, there has been a great deal of controversy about the use to which Turkey has put these weapons, particularly the attacks on the Kurdish community that have come using primarily American jet fighters, and bombs and missiles that have come from America and a variety of other European countries. And of course, Turkey's internal repression and human rights abuses, which has come through the use of tools of repression and abuses from some of those countries I've mentioned, but also from a country like Israel. So Turkey is one of those countries that when we investigate it, what we find about its role in the global arms trade is extremely negative and problematic.
What are the parallels that you see between the ongoing incarceration of Abdullah Öcalan on Imrala Island and the incarceration of Nelson Mandela in South Africa?
I think there are some differences, but I think that there are a lot of similarities. I think that you're talking about two very charismatic, iconic people who have both personally and ideologically led a struggle for justice and equality for their people. Both are leaders who wanted to pursue a peaceful path, but were forced by the aggression and militarism of their opponents, the Turkish state, obviously, and in the South African case, the apartheid state, were forced to take up armed struggle, effectively to defend their people. And they did this very reluctantly. I think other similarities are the centrality of gender, the role of women in the struggle and in political life, and participative democracy. These are two things that have struck me as being similar across the two leaders. And I think they also have sought for a better world for all. A big slogan of the ANC during the liberation struggle and the early years of our democracy was a better life for all. And I think that my understanding of Abdullah Öcalan is that he has a very similar perspective, not just for the Kurdish people and what a Kurdish state could look like, but for the world as a whole. But of course, the main similarity is the way in which they have been targeted, prescribed by not only their own opponents like the Turkish government and the South African apartheid state, but by other states as well. So just as a number of Western states have prescribed Öcalan's organization, the ANC was also dealt very heavy blows by America and the United Kingdom, who actually encouraged the South Africans to execute Mr. Mandela, who served 27 years in prison, because they thought he was too dangerous to keep alive. And of course, once he came to power, we saw that he was exactly the opposite, that he was central to our democracy, to a better life for all.
What are some of the key factors, in your opinion, that enabled the South African liberation movement to succeed?
I think there were a number of factors. I think the determination of the majority of South African people to fight for their rights was undimmed throughout our liberation struggle. And effectively what South Africa did was we made the townships, the black areas, 83% of the people of the country, the areas they lived in, were made effectively ungovernable. It became almost impossible for the apartheid security forces to enter into these areas and to administer and govern these areas in any meaningful way. I think the other very important factor in success was a constant global diplomatic effort and the building of significant support around the world. The international anti-apartheid movement was crucial in the struggle to liberate South Africa from apartheid and racism. And perhaps the most important part of that struggle was boycotts that were led globally by students against two of the biggest banks, who enabled South Africa to borrow money cheaply so that it could buy its arms imports, its oil imports, etc. So effectively a system of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the apartheid state by the global community. So I think that internal factor of the determination and will of the majority of people and the international solidarity and support.
I would like to ask you about your family, about the letter from your great grandfather from Vienna under the Nazi occupation. What did you feel when you first read the letter? Can you tell us a bit more about your family?
So my mother, who was Austrian, survived the Holocaust in Nazi-occupied Vienna itself, one of very few Jews to survive in Vienna. But she lost, it's estimated, 39 members of her family in the concentration camps at Theresienstadt and Auschwitz in particular. And she only survived by being hidden in a cellar underneath the house they lived in for 3.5 years. And whenever there was an SS or a Gestapo raid in the area, she would be wrapped up in a carpet and the carpet would be put up against the wall. But the Nazis never managed to actually access the cellar, which was protected by a very thick steel wall. But they received at their home in the late 1930s from my mother's grandfather an absolutely tragic letter, which he started off by saying, "I write this to bid you farewell, as I'm about to embark on a journey to which I am not looking forward." He knew that he was about to be taken to a concentration camp and he would never return. And I actually used that letter to introduce the first ever motion on Holocaust remembrance introduced in the South African Parliament. So my mother's experience, the experience of the Holocaust and of Nazism have my entire life driven my anti-racism and my deep commitment to justice and equality.
Genocides are still continues in some way. Turkey's Middle East policy, as we can see, as we can witness every day, how do you evaluate their attacks against the Kurds?
I think that we are seeing cases where authoritarian governments, and I would regard the Turkish government under President Erdogan as certainly that, it's both authoritarian and corrupt, has to have an other, an enemy. For South Africa's apartheid regime, it was Black South Africans. For the Nazis, it was obviously the Jews. And everything that went wrong in society is blamed on that other, on the enemy. And Turkey does that an enormous amount with the Kurds. And I think the brutal way in which Turkey addresses the Kurds' demand for statehood, demand for liberation, is very reminiscent of aspects of what has gone on in authoritarian regimes from Nazi Germany through apartheid South Africa and onwards. They use massive force, illegitimately and illegally, in my opinion. They close down freedom of expression, freedom of political association, obviously freedom of the media, and they try and get world support for what they're doing by exerting their economic and diplomatic strength around the world. So I think we're seeing many of the worst elements of these sorts of authoritarianisms being used by the Turkish state against the Kurdish people.
The movie Shadow World is based on your book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. The film explores the multi-billion dollars international arms trade. In addition to your political identity, you are also an expert in arms trade. To what extent are international law and conventions observed in arms trade?
So the reality is that the global arms trade, as it's structured today, exists on its own legal planet, where politicians, governments are able to ignore their own rules and laws. They're able to ignore multilateral or regional agreements, and they're able to ignore international laws and agreements. So all of these things are effectively voluntary. And those who participate in the trade, and it's really important to remember here that the biggest arms dealers on the planet are our political leaders, who buy and sell more weaponry than anyone else, than any of these dodgy arms dealers depicted in films and other things. And the reality is that, that countries sell to whoever they want, regardless of the human rights abuses or conflicts that those countries or governments are engaged in, and that there are no consequences for that. We see that primarily today in the conflict in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been violating international humanitarian law and likely committing war crimes. But the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and others continue to sell them weapons that enable them to murder innocent civilians in Yemen. And we see exactly the same thing in relation to sales to Turkey and what Turkey is using those weapons for in relation to the Kurdish people. And there are no consequences for countries and governments like the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, etc., who continue to sell Erdogan these weapons with which he can do what he wants. And it shows that the global arms trade, which is deeply corrupt and benefits politicians both individually and their political parties, operates above the law. And it's because it is primarily complicity between our politicians, our military leaders, our intelligence services, the companies that make the weapons, and we, the taxpayers, fund all of that.
Thank you. Previously owned company Rain Metal some officials in Turkey had been on the news about the bribery. I would like to hear your opinion on the relationship between accountability, the lack in the functioning of democratic institutions, and purchasing weapons. But please, very short, very briefly.
The reality is that Rheinmetall is one of the most corrupt weapons makers on the planet. It is also a company that is enabling Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey to effectively do what it wants with its weapons and to produce its own weapons. The corruption of the company primarily undermines accountable democracy in the countries that it sells to. Of course, Saudi Arabia and UAE have no democracy. Turkey has a partial democracy like apartheid South Africa did. But Rheinmetall is at the forefront of the worst practices of the global arms trade. So it's absolutely no surprise to me that it has such a close relationship with the Erdogan government in Turkey. And I feel sure that the deals that it's involved in, which almost always involve an element of corruption, are not only benefiting Erdogan himself personally, but are benefiting the political elite in Turkey through bribes.
Turkey among the most arms importing countries, from Russia's S-400s purchased to Israel-made Herons, German Rheinmetall, Leopard tanks are the work of the dirty relation side of the thing. So, what would you say regarding the arms deal with Britain to Turkey? Short,
So,
very briefly, please, that
sure.
one as well.
So over the past few years, the United Kingdom has sold almost £1.5 billion of weapons to the Erdogan regime, even though there is massive evidence of corruption in these deals, of the weapons being used against the Kurdish people and being used for repression, including torture within Turkey itself. So the United Kingdom arms industry and government is effectively propping up the Erdogan regime to behave in the manner that it behaves in today. And it is completely unacceptable. And we as British citizens and residents, as I am, should be calling on the British government and other governments to stop all arms sales and all military cooperation with the Turkish regime.
South African former politician and author of Shadow Work book and film, Andrew Feinstein. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your comments today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.